They thought he was just another puppet. What he did next made them choke on their champagne. The boardroom was drenched in opulence. Crystal glasses clinking, leather chairs creaking under the weight of billion-dollar egos. A map of Burkina Faso lay spread across the table like a feast, its gold veins marked in red, its lithium fields circled in blue. Western CEOs chuckled as they carved up contracts, sipping vintage wine and trading jokes about another easy win in Africa. One leaned back, smirking. They'll sign. They always do. But the door didn't open to a handshake. It slammed. Ibrahim Traoré stepped in, not with a smile, but with a silence that cut through the room like a blade. No entourage, no translator, just a folder in his hand and fire in his eyes. He didn't sit. He didn't greet. He simply placed the folder on the table. Inside, a termination of all foreign mineral contracts. Effective immediately. The laughter died. You don't understand the consequences, one executive stammered. Traoré's voice was calm. No, you don't understand the cost of theft disguised as partnership. A pause. Then chaos. Phones lit up. Lawyers whispered. One CEO stood, red-faced, demanding negotiations. Traoré turned to leave. Burkina Faso is not for sale. The door closed behind him, but the tremor had already begun. That wasn't just a speech. It was the start of a $60 billion war. For decades, the soil of Burkina Faso whispered riches. Gold glimmering beneath the dust, lithium pulsing through the rock, rare earths buried like secrets. But the people who walked that land saw none of it. Instead, foreign corporations arrived with briefcases and bodyguards, carving out contracts that drained the nation dry. The minerals flowed outward. The poverty stayed behind. It wasn't just theft. It was humiliation. Western CEOs called it partnership. But in reality, it was a one-sided extraction. They built no roads, no schools, no hospitals. They left behind craters and promises. Generations of Burkinabe children grew up watching trucks rumble past their villages, loaded with wealth they'd never touch. Their futures were exported, ton by ton, ounce by ounce. And the world barely blinked. Global media focused on instability, not injustice. They spoke of coups, not contracts. They framed Africa as a continent of chaos, never questioning who profited from that chaos. Burkina Faso became a footnote in boardroom memos, a line item in quarterly earnings. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. A new generation began asking questions. Why were foreign companies making billions while locals couldn't afford clean water? Why did the government sign deals that mortgaged the nation's soul? And why, in a land so rich, were the people so poor? That's when Ibrahim Traoré emerged, not as a politician, but as a reckoning. He didn't speak in slogans. He spoke in facts. He didn't beg for reform. He demanded justice. And behind him stood a nation tired of being robbed, tired of being silenced, tired of being told to wait. This wasn't just about minerals. It was about dignity. And just when the world stopped watching, Traoré made his move. They wore tailored suits and spoke in polished tones. But their legacy was anything but refined. The Western CEOs who descended on Burkina Faso came not as partners, but as inheritors of a colonial playbook, one rewritten in boardrooms, not battlefields. Their smiles masked centuries of extraction, their contracts cloaked in diplomacy, their intentions soaked in profit. They preached democracy in press releases while funding instability behind closed doors. When elections didn't serve their interests, they whispered to generals. When leaders resisted, they dangled aid packages with strings tied to mineral rights. Their power wasn't in tanks. It was in spreadsheets, lobbyists, and offshore accounts. One executive, hailed as a visionary in European media, had personally overseen deals that gave his company access to gold reserves worth billions, while Burkina Faso received pennies on the dollar. Another boasted of sustainable partnerships, even as his firm dumped toxic waste near villages, poisoning water sources and futures alike. They called it development. Locals called it betrayal. These men, mostly European, some American, moved through Africa like monarchs. They flew in on private jets, met behind tinted windows, and left with signatures that guaranteed decades of control. Their arrogance wasn't just personal, it was institutional. They believed the continent owed them its riches, that its leaders were temporary, but their contracts eternal. And they had history on their side. For generations, Western powers had perfected the art of economic domination. They built systems where African nations were forced to borrow from the very institutions that had once colonized them. They set terms, dictated reforms, and ensured that even independence came with a price tag. CEOs became the new governors. Corporations replaced empires. But their hypocrisy ran deeper. They spoke of human rights while ignoring the child labor in their supply chains. They championed transparency while hiding profits in tax havens. They funded think tanks that warned of African instability, while their own actions destabilized entire regions. They were masters of the double standard, celebrated in Davos, condemned in Ouagadougou. And they were confident, too confident. When Ibrahim Traoré rose to power, they saw a young leader with no diplomatic pedigree. They assumed he'd play by the rules, accept the handshakes, nod through the meetings, and sign whatever was placed before him. They mistook his silence for submission, his youth for naivety, his patriotism for posturing. They didn't see the fire beneath the surface. Traoré wasn't interested in photo ops or polite negotiations. He had studied their tactics, understood their leverage, and prepared his counterattack. While they laughed over mineral maps, he was redrawing the lines of sovereignty. While they plotted profits, he was building alliances, not with corporations, but with his people. And when he walked into that boardroom, he didn't come to negotiate. He came to dismantle. The CEOs scrambled. They called embassies, summoned lawyers, and threatened sanctions. But Traoré didn't flinch, because he wasn't playing their game. He was rewriting the rules. He wasn't born into power. He was forged in its absence. Ibrahim Traoré grew up in a Burkina Faso that had been carved up by foreign hands and forgotten by global headlines. His childhood was marked not by privilege, but by silence, the kind that hangs over villages where promises never arrive. He watched his elders speak of independence with pride, even as their land was leased away in contracts they couldn't read. He chose the military not for ambition, but for discipline. It was the only institution that demanded order in a country drowning in chaos. There, he learned strategy, not just of battle, but of restraint. He studied history, not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's long betrayal. From Lumumba to Sankara, he traced the footsteps of leaders who dared to dream beyond borders. But Traoré didn't chase martyrdom. He chased clarity. While others climbed ranks through allegiance, he built trust through action. He refused bribes. He rejected foreign training programs designed to mold African officers into Western proxies. Instead, he listened to farmers, to students, to mothers who had buried their children under the weight of poverty. His loyalty was never to a regime. It was to the people, and the people noticed. When corruption spread through the capital like wildfire, Traoré remained untouched. When foreign companies tightened their grip, he loosened his. Silence. He began speaking, not loudly, but deliberately. His words didn't echo in parliament. They echoed in markets, in classrooms, in barracks. He became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of possibility. Then came the moment. A coup was brewing, fueled by frustration and fatigue. Traoré didn't seize it. It came to him. Soldiers rallied behind his integrity. Civilians whispered his name with hope. And when the dust settled, he stood not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker of a broken nation. But he didn't rush to the podium. He didn't flood the airwaves. He governed with silence, with listening, with resolve. His first act wasn't to sign a deal, it was to cancel one. His second wasn't to seek applause, it was to seek justice. He wore no crown. He carried no ego. But in his calm, there was thunder. Traoré wasn't just a soldier turned statesman. He was a mirror, reflecting what Burkina Faso could be if it stopped bending to foreign will. His Pan-African ideals weren't slogans. They were strategy. His grassroots support wasn't orchestrated. It was earned. And that quiet resolve? It was about to shake the global order. The conference room was colder than usual, not from the air conditioning, but from the tension that hung in the air like smoke. Western envoys sat stiffly, their expressions rehearsed, their briefcases filled with revised contracts and veiled ultimatums. Across from them, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone. No aides, no notes, just a quiet stare that unsettled even the most seasoned diplomat. One envoy leaned forward, voice smooth but sharp. President Traoré, we understand your concerns. But abrupt nationalization sends the wrong signal to investors. Stability is a shared responsibility. Traoré didn't blink. Stability built on theft is not stability. It's submission. Another envoy chimed in, this time with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We're prepared to offer development aid, schools, infrastructure, healthcare. In exchange, of course, for a cooperative framework. Traoré's reply was measured. We've had your aid. It built your access roads to our minds. Not hospitals for our children. The room shifted. A third envoy, more aggressive, dropped the pretense. You're jeopardizing Burkina Faso's future. Sanctions are not off the table. The IMF is watching. So is Washington. Traoré leaned in, voice low but firm. Let them watch. We've been watched for decades. While our gold built your skyscrapers, our people drank from poison wells. The envoys exchanged glances. The media had already begun spinning the story. Traoré risks isolation. Burkina Faso turns rogue. Headlines crafted to pressure, to shame, to corner. But Traoré didn't flinch. He spoke of sovereignty, not survival. Of dignity, not dependency. And with each word, the envoys grew more agitated. Their threats became louder. Their tone more desperate. They were used to leaders who folded under pressure. But Traoré was unmoved. One CEO, red-faced and sweating, slammed his hand on the table. You're making a mistake. You'll regret this. Traoré stood slowly. The only mistake is believing we were too weak to choose our own destiny. Then came the moment that silenced the room. The silence in the room was suffocating. The envoys had run out of threats. The CEOs had run out of patience. But Ibrahim Traoré hadn't run out of resolve. He reached into his folder and pulled out a document thicker than any contract they'd ever signed. It wasn't a proposal. It was a reckoning. This, he said, placing it on the table, is the audit. The pages detailed decades of exploitation, contracts signed in secrecy, clauses that gave foreign companies 90% of profits, environmental violations buried under legal jargon. It named names. It traced money. It exposed the machinery of modern colonialism dressed up as commerce. One CEO leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You can't just tear up agreements. These are protected under international law. Cooperative framework. Traoré's reply was measured. We've had your aid. It built your access roads to our minds. Not hospitals for our children. The room shifted. A third envoy, more aggressive, dropped the pretense. You're jeopardizing Burkina Faso's future. Sanctions are not off the table. The IMF is watching. So is Washington. Traoré leaned in, voice low but firm. Let them watch. We've been watched for decades. While our gold built your skyscrapers, our people drank from poison wells. The envoys exchanged glances. The media had already begun spinning the story. Traoré risks isolation. Burkina Faso turns rogue. Headlines crafted to pressure, to shame, to corner. But Traoré didn't flinch. He spoke of sovereignty, not survival. Of dignity, not dependency. And with each word, the envoys grew more agitated. Their threats became louder. Their tone more desperate. They were used to leaders who folded under pressure. But Traoré was unmoved. One CEO, red-faced and sweating, slammed his hand on the table. You're making a mistake. You'll regret this. Traoré stood slowly. The only mistake is believing we were too weak to choose our own destiny. Then came the moment that silenced the room. The silence in the room was suffocating. The envoys had run out of threats. The CEOs had run out of patience. But Ibrahim Traoré hadn't run out of resolve. He reached into his folder and pulled out a document thicker than any contract they'd ever signed. It wasn't a proposal. It was a reckoning. This, he said, placing it on the table, is the audit. The pages detailed decades of exploitation, contracts signed in secrecy, clauses that gave foreign companies 90% of profits, environmental violations buried under legal jargon. It named names. It traced money. It exposed the machinery of modern colonialism dressed up as commerce. One CEO leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You can't just tear up agreements. These are protected under international law. Traoré didn't flinch. Protected by whom? The same courts that never ruled in our favor? The same institutions that watched us starve while our gold funded your bonuses. He turned to the envoys. Burkina Faso has reviewed every contract signed in the last 30 years. And we found fraud. We found coercion. We found signatures obtained under duress. We found deals that violated our constitution. Another envoy tried to interject. You're destabilizing the region. No, Traoré cut in. You destabilized it when you built wealth on our suffering. Then came the announcement. Effective immediately, all foreign mineral contracts were nullified. Strategic assets, gold mines, lithium fields, rare earth processing plants, would be placed under national control. A new state-owned enterprise would oversee extraction, with profits reinvested into healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Military units had already secured key sites. Engineers were en route. The transition was not a threat. It was already happening. The room erupted. CEOs shouted. Envoys scrambled for their phones. One executive stormed out, muttering about lawsuits and sanctions. But Traoré remained calm. He turned to the cameras. The press had been invited. The world was watching. We are not your colony, he said, voice steady. We are the architects of our future. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou exploded with celebration. Crowds gathered around screens, cheering as the announcement played. Flags waved. Drums pounded. Elders wept. Young people danced. It wasn't just a policy shift, it was a resurrection. Social media lit up within minutes. Hashtag Traoré takedown trended across Africa. Memes mocked the stunned CEOs. Influencers called it the most gangster move in modern African history. Commentators compared it to Sankara's revolution, but with digital firepower. In Paris, stock prices of mining companies plummeted. In Washington, analysts scrambled to assess the fallout. In London, headlines read, Burkina Faso declares economic independence. But in Ouagadougou, the mood was electric. Traoré walked through the capital that evening, not in a motorcade, but on foot. People reached out to touch his shoulder, to thank him, to cry. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions had already said everything. At a rally later that night, he addressed the nation. For too long, we were told to wait, to be patient, to accept crumbs while our wealth fed empires. Today, we say no more. Today, we reclaim what is ours, not with hatred, but with purpose, not with vengeance, but with vision. He paused, letting the silence settle. This is not just about Burkina Faso. This is about every nation that has been told it is too poor, too weak, too dependent. We are none of those things. We are rich in spirit, in soil, in strength. And we will rise. The crowd roared. But the ripple effect was just beginning. The announcement reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within hours, the global order felt the tremor. In Accra, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, young Africans flooded social media with pride and disbelief. TikTok videos stitched Traoré's speech with Sankara's legacy. Instagram stories lit up with the Burkinabe flag. Twitter, now X, was ablaze with hashtags. Hashtag Traoré takedown. Hashtag Africa rising. Hashtag not your colony. The continent wasn't just watching. It was awakening. Commentators called it the most daring move since Sankara. Analysts scrambled to explain how a 36-year-old leader had outmaneuvered billion-dollar corporations with nothing but conviction and clarity. Editorials in Al Jazeera and The Guardian hailed it as a blueprint for post-colonial sovereignty. Even critics admitted something seismic had occurred. In Paris, the mood was panic. Mining stocks plunged. Executives held emergency meetings. Lobbyists flooded government offices, demanding retaliation. But the damage was done. The illusion of control had shattered. Wall Street trembled. Investors pulled out of African ventures, fearing a domino effect. Financial networks ran segments titled The Traoré Shockwave. One anchor asked, "Is this the end of Western dominance in African resources?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Meanwhile, in Washington and Brussels, diplomats debated sanctions. But behind closed doors, they knew. Traoré hadn't broken the law. He had exposed it. He hadn't destabilized the region. He had destabilized their grip. And in Ouagadougou, the celebration continued. Murals of Traoré appeared overnight, painted on walls, etched into alleyways, projected onto buildings. Children chanted his name. Elders called him the son of Sankara. Local radio played revolutionary songs. It wasn't just political. It was spiritual. But the most telling reaction came from other capitals. In Mali, whispers of similar audits began. In Niger, youth groups demanded transparency. In Congo, lawmakers cited Traoré's speech in parliament. The ripple effect was no longer theoretical. It was strategic. And now, Other nations were watching and planning. They came for our gold. We gave them a revolution. In the quiet after the storm, the world began to understand what had truly happened. This wasn't just a policy shift. It wasn't a nationalist stunt or a populist gamble. It was a redefinition of power, one that didn't rely on tanks or treaties, but on truth. Ibrahim Traoré had done what few dared. He rewrote the script handed to post-colonial nations. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for validation. He stood in the face of centuries of exploitation and said, "Enough." And in doing so, he became more than a president. He became a symbol of resistance, not the kind that burns out in fury, but the kind that builds in silence, in strategy, in sacrifice. A symbol of rebirth, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation told it was too small to matter, too poor to rise, too broken to heal. But the lesson wasn't just for Africa. It was for every immigrant who's ever been told to be grateful for crumbs. For every worker whose labor built fortunes they'll never touch. For every citizen who's watched their culture be commodified, their voice be silenced, their story be rewritten. Traoré's stand was a mirror. It reflected the universal truth: justice is not given. It is claimed. And in that claiming, there is power. He didn't offer vengeance. He offered vision. He didn't seek applause. He sought accountability. And in doing so, he reminded the world that leadership is not about charisma, it's about courage. The courage to say no when the world expects yes. The courage to protect what others have normalized losing. The courage to believe that history is not a trap, it's a canvas. And so, as the dust settled and the headlines faded, one question remained. Not in boardrooms, but in classrooms. Not in embassies, but in villages. Not in think tanks, but in hearts. Who's next? Who will rise with the same clarity? Who will choose dignity over deals? Who will remind the world that identity is not a liability, but a legacy? Because they came for our gold. We gave them a revolution. And now, the world is watching. They thought he was just another name on a dotted line. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't just reject their contracts. He rewrote the rules of engagement. In a world where empires are built on silence, he chose to speak. In a system designed to extract, he chose to reclaim. And in doing so, he outsmarted billion-dollar corporations and took back $60 billion worth of stolen wealth. This wasn't just a victory for Burkina Faso. It was a signal to every nation, every community, every individual who's been told to stay small. Traoré proved that courage, clarity, and conviction can shake the foundations of global power. So if you believe in dignity over deals, in sovereignty over submission, in truth over spin, this story is yours to carry forward. Share it. Let it echo in classrooms, in living rooms, in boardrooms. Subscribe to stay connected to stories that challenge, inspire, and ignite. Be part of the movement that refuses to be silenced. Because the world isn't changed by those who wait. It's changed by those who dare. And if Traoré could do it, who's to say you can't? The revolution isn't over. It's just begun.